Well, hello, and welcome to our uh, podcast study through the Bible there. Uh, Things are going great here at the church and getting ready for the Labor Day fair. If you'd like to help, we need help with sorting and putting things out for rummage sale stuff as we prepare next week for doing all the things, cleaning up the church, all that stuff. We're meeting at Saturday at 10 o'clock if you'd like to join us for some of that here at the church. But other than that, things are going along smoothly. As you know, we ended the book of Genesis last week, and Exodus picks up right where Genesis left off, just a few years later, obviously, but pretty consistent with following the narrative of the Bible. You remember Joseph. You remember that him and Israel and their whole family were there in Egypt, and this kind of picks up where that left off. Now, this leads a lot to understand about the Bible, with Exodus being pretty common book, pretty famous for the idea of Charlton Heston made a movie, and that became kind of predominant thing for my generation. See it. Some of your generations may have not. I don't know. But Charlton Heston made the Ten Commandments, pretty famous, and then we know the Ten Commandments. It's controversial all over the world as people put them up in places, and they get upset about putting them up in places. And the Ten Commandments are just good things. Almost all of our laws are based on the Ten Commandments, and every good society actually follows them. Corrupt societies do not, and they become corrupt real quickly if they do not. So the Ten Commandments are valuable, but they're all found in the book of Exodus, along with the story of why God gave them to his people. And it's written by Moses, of course. It is a firsthand experience. Moses is writing something he personally witnessed from his childhood, and God fills in on some of the details he didn't know. But the prior arrangement, they would have all known that Joseph brought them there, and that the children of Israel would have known their history. So when we get to the book of Exodus, we get to kind of a historical account of the children of Israel and where they went from Genesis into Exodus, which will take us into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges, and you'll see historical evidence of the complete walkthrough of the life of Israel. So let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation now are gone. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so the land was filled with them." So Moses, the author of Exodus, recounts the history of Israel entering into the land of Egypt. Moses referring back to the story he originally told in Genesis 46, how Israel left Canaan and ended up in Egypt. So he tells all the people that once again came. And in Genesis 46, he recounts all the descendants again so that they can look at that. But so Joseph's story, we don't need to go into again, or Noah or any of that stuff in the book of Genesis. You're very familiar with that. And if not, go back and watch the podcasts on the book of Genesis, and you will see. And verse 8 says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And you need to know, Joseph was very well loved, so much so that it took a while for them to no longer understand who Joseph was and appreciate what Joseph had done. This is how life is on everything, though. People will begin to forget how good you were to them eventually. And this happens to everybody, and now it happens to Joseph. When Joseph came to enter, he entered the land during the 16th dynasty. The 13th through the 17th dynasties were ruled by people called the Hyksos. These people were not Egyptians, but foreigners from the region of Haran and the Fertile Crescent. They conquered the Egyptians in 1670 BC. The Hyksos were Semitic people descended from Noah's son Shem. They shared the same family origins as the Hebrew people. But the people of Egypt were Hamites, descendants from Noah's son Ham. So the Semites were the rulers over Egypt, but they themselves were not Egyptians. The Egyptians hated the Hyksos conquerors and Semites in general. Naturally, the Hyksos themselves were welcoming to the other Semite people who desired to immigrate into Egypt. The presence of these other Semites in the land helped strengthen the Hyksos rule over the native Egyptian people. This explains why Joseph was elevated into power by the Hyksos Pharaoh. As a fellow Semite, Joseph was welcomed by the Hyksos ruler. But here we see that eventually, when they were out of ruler, now Egyptian was back in ruler, they were kind of bitter towards those people, so they quickly forgot them. In verse 9, he said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor and mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So basically, we have this story of great blessing. They're growing as a nation, and now there's the Egyptians that are afraid of them. Now, to be fair to the Egyptians, the previous rulers of them were also people who took advantage of them and ruled over them because they were mightier than they. So now the Egyptians are seeing the Israelites grow, and they're very mighty, and now they see them as a threat. So they basically enslave them, but they still grow. And now they're scared to death of them. So in verse 15, it says, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them." So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So Amenhotep gives direction to head of the midwives of Israel to begin killing all male children at birth. This is very evil, but it's a way of genocide, really basically trying to get rid of a nation. Now, later on, the abortion person who invented abortion and pushed for abortion actually had the same mentality. Her mentality was to destroy the black race. So she figured if she could kill all the babies, then eventually she would destroy the black race. And to some extent, she did. She succeeded. Planned Parenthood and all these organizations that people constantly defend were designed as a racist organization to kill black children. That's historically proven. I'm not making up something from some political party. That is 100% proven and 100% true. And to this day, the majority of abortion clinics are found in areas that are predominantly black cultural areas. That's not an accident, but that's not new. Satan's plan to destroy and kill babies continues in our society today with abortion, and it continued it's been going on for a very long time. Killing the male babies does slow down the race in some aspects of things, and there's no doubt about that. And so the midwives, though, didn't do what they had been asked to do because they feared God. When Pharaoh realized that they were still running around, it's a lie, but one intended to protect God's people in the face of a greater sin, similar to the choice Rahab faced. And as a reward, God establishes a household for them. There is a big argument, was Rahab's lie justified? Were these lies justified? And the answer to that question is, lying is not a justified action, but it is a forgivable action if it's done to subvert a bigger sin. So in other words, to lie to a king to save the life of a baby is not necessarily okay, but it's easily forgivable. And God easily forgiven that sin because the sin of killing the baby was much worse. And God showed favor to them for that. In verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born to you, you are to cast in the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. He takes it up a notch and he says, listen, you throw your child in the Nile, which would be instant death. Of course, alligators can't swim, all this other stuff. Exodus chapter 2 picks up. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of a Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The story of Moses begins with mention of his parents. They are not named here, though we finally get their names in Exodus 6. Both his parents are of the tribe of Levi. In fact, Moses' father married his own aunt, which was permitted in that day. In verse 2, the father gives birth to a son, and immediately she notices something unique about this boy. The text says he was beautiful, but the Hebrew word is tav, which has a wide variety of meanings. It usually means good or beautiful or favorable, but it can also mean worthy or pleasing, as in pleasing in the sight of the Lord. We know every other mother thinks her son so beautiful, so this can't be the only reason she felt the need to hide her son. Perhaps the other Jewish mothers tried to hide their children as well, but the meaning of the verse is that Moses' mother had faith in God, that her son was special to his plan in some way. In Hebrews 11, which is the faith chapter in the Bible, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So we see this situation played out where now Exodus is put into a basket with pitch so it doesn't sink and set down the river into the reeds. And the sister stands by and watches to see what is going to happen. It's sort of like putting your faith and trust in God and saying, if you've got a plan for this child, well, I'm going to set him free. And if you have a plan, you'll save his life. In verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the women took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, because I drew him out of the water. So obviously God's plan was to save Noah's life, or Moses' life in this situation. Just like he saved Noah with a boat, he saved Moses with a little boat himself. The daughter of Pharaoh was bathing in the Nile, which was a common practice. We don't know if she was able to have children, and maybe that's what motivated her to save the child. But her own mother, Moses' mom, gets the benefit of raising Moses until his 5th birthday. In verse 10, Pharaoh's daughter named Moses. His name in Hebrew is Moshe, which is actually an Egyptian word. Members of Egyptian dynasty took their names from dynasty family members' names. So the family name of the 18th dynasty was Moshesh or Mose. Notice that the first ruler in a dynasty period was Amos, and the current pharaoh is Thutmose. So Moses was probably given a larger name at this point. We don't know what the first part of his name was probably the name of the Nile River god. This would explain why Hatshepsut says Moses' name was a reminder that he was taken from the river. So in Exodus 2:11, it says, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that. When he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So in verse 11, we're now get to Moses' personality. When he notices an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, at this point, Moses decides to act in defense of the Hebrew, his own family. He first makes sure that no Egyptian is watching. Then when the coast is clear, Moses kills the Egyptian taskmaster and buries him in the sand. This scene raises more questions than it answers. Moses could have visited the Hebrew slaves any day in his first 40 years. And if he had made such a visit, he probably would have seen the same scene playing out many times. an Egyptian taskmaster beating Hebrew. This had been happening for years, so why did Moses take action at this point? Two places in the New Testament help fill in the gaps to explain Moses' behavior. Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater than the riches and treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Hebrews says that Moses reached a point when, by faith, he repudiated his identity as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. This decision carried significant implications for him, of course. It meant setting aside a life of power and comfort in the Pharaoh's house. He would no longer have access to the wealth of Egypt and the fine living it provided. This is probably the moment when Moses dropped the first part of his name. In this way, Moses chose to be associated with the Hebrew people. So, as being one of the Hebrew people, now he rises up to defend the Hebrew people. In verse 13, he went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion? But he said, who made you a prince or judge over us? Are you intended to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and said, surely the matter has become known. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So murder obviously is a crime in any country in the world, any civilized country for sure. And Moses kills this Egyptian, and he thinks he's got away with it because he buried him in the sand. The next day, he sees two Israelites fighting, and he's trying to get them to stop fighting because it makes no sense for them to fight. And one of them says, hey, you're not our judge. Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? The cat is out of the bag, and it wasn't long before Pharaoh heard this. Now, remember, Moses is not representing himself as part of their family now. I'm sure that if he was part of the family, he would have gotten some opportunity to defend his case. I'm sure Pharaoh's daughter would have defended him and said, well, hey, let's listen to what he has to say. But because he had turned away from the throne, he had pulled a Prince Harry, and he wasn't going to get the benefits which came along with the throne. So he tried to kill Moses, and Moses fled. Who knows how he fled? Nobody says how, or anyone that helped him. But now he is in Midian. In verse 16, it says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, why have you come back so soon today? So they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat. Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So Moses is in Midian, which is the northeast corner of Saudi Arabia, just south of the Jordan River. While there, he encounters 7 daughters who came together to draw water. As the story goes, basically a band of hooligans or shepherds drove the women off, and this must have been common because the father's response was, why are you back so soon? In other words, they probably had been driven off multiple times, usually every day, and the shepherds would eventually fill the waters and they would leave, and then they would be able to do that. So it took them a lot longer. When he finds out about the Egyptian helping them, he says to them, why did you leave the man behind? Well, he did something good for you. Let's do something good for him. And he brings him into his house, gives him a daughter, and he now has a son as a result. So Moses' early life is looking pretty decent. In verse 23, it says, now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. After 40 years, the Pharaoh dies. The Pharaoh is Thutmose III, who has desired to kill Moses and anyone connected to Hatshepsut. With Thutmose III's passing, his son Amenhotep becomes the power in Egypt in 1447 BC. At about that time, the Lord heard the groaning of the people of Israel and remembered his covenant with Abraham. Whenever we see the Bible using human characteristics to describe the Lord and his actions, we are observing an anthropomorphism. In this case, God is described as hearing and remembering, which are human traits. God is all spirit, therefore does not hear with ears and doesn't remember as if to call to mind something forgotten. All things are continually before God's attention, and his knowledge has no limits. Therefore, these statements are saying something about God, but we are not literal descriptions of God. When the scriptures describe God as hearing, it means God is inclined toward a plea or a request. Likewise, when God remembers, it means the time for God to act has come to pass. So we pick up Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. Moses is near Horeb, the mountain of God. Remember, Midian is roughly directed south of Canaan in the northwestern tip of Saudi Arabia. As Moses is in this area, he comes upon a bush burning in the desert. In this region of the Middle East, the weather is incredibly hot. It virtually never rains, and it's not uncommon for shrubs to catch fire in the intense heat and dryness. In this case, though, Moses can tell there's something different because the bush isn't being consumed by the fire, so he goes to investigate. So we see him heading to this bush, and we have a lot of stories in the Bible that talk about this burning bush and refer to Moses being spoken from the Lord, and many times the Lord spoke out of fire and other things like that. In verse 4, it says, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. And he said, do not come near here, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the son of Israel, out of Egypt. God begins in explaining his purpose to Moses. God is ready to respond to the affliction of Israel. God will deliver the nation from Egypt. Notice that God doesn't say Moses will deliver them. God will deliver them. And then he talks about the land flowing with milk and honey, which sounds delicious. In verse 11, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Having heard God's instruction, Moses asked the obvious question, which is, who am I? Why me? In verse 13, then Moses said to God, behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am, which is a constant theme throughout the rest of the Bible. And he said, thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. In verse 16, it says, go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say, and you will be the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians. So there's a lot going on in this part. And the first part, obviously, is what he wants them to say to the children of Israel. Now, this is interesting because the children of Israel, although they're still God-fearing, they have not seen God work. So they're in slavery, they're in misery, which a lot of time in misery, you turn to God for assistance or help or support. And the Israelites were no different. In their misery, they turned to God and they basically beg him for help. And in this situation, Moses raises a very valid point. He says, how are they going to know that it's God who sent them? They're in a pagan culture where multiple gods are worshipped and many gods are there. So how are we going to know you're the one true God? What am I supposed to tell them to convince them that I'm the one true God? And he gives them a little history lesson. I am the father of all of these nations. I am the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham. And he kind of gives them a little history lesson to say, look, I'm this God who brought them out. And I'm going to give them the land I promised them through when he promised to Abraham. And he said, you're going to go as a group and you're going to ask to go 3 days and worship. He's not going to let you. And then I'm going to make it so that you can leave permanently. And not only will you leave, but you're going to leave with a bunch of merchandise in gold and silver. So basically what he tells them to tell them is a very good story that's very convincing, but also would give them a little hope, right? So not only are you going to be set free from slavery, but you're also going to be given a bunch of gold and silver to start your journey in freedom from slavery. So what he tells them is basically, it's not just getting freedom from slavery. You're going to get a bunch of stuff too. So right now you have nothing. You're in slavery, you're in misery, you're having a rough time. But I'm going to tell you that your God is coming. I'm going to rescue you. And then I'm going to give you a bunch of gold and silver to take with you on the journey to your new land, which will be flowing with milk and honey. This would have been very good news to slaves. It would have been like going in the South and during the Civil War and saying to the slaves, listen, not only are we coming to rescue you, you're going to be freed, but we're going to give you each $1 million to start your new life with. That would have brought all kinds of hope and excitement to the slaves in the South during the Civil War. And you could imagine that this is what the Egyptians or the Israelites are being told about the Egyptians here. And he told them basically, they're not going to let you go free, but I'm going to do some miraculous works, which would have been, once again, proof of God's power. And they would have been able to see this and would have been even more awestruck, you would think, more supportive of this plan to get free from Egypt. We'll pick up next week in chapter 4, where it picks up with the story of Moses. And so as we move along, you're going to see how this all plays out. It's a little bit different than you saw with Charlton Heston. We're going to play it out. It's similar. It gives you the basics, but it's also going to show you some background stuff that's going on that you don't see in the movies, and you'll never see probably in the movies. But we'll define it out for you and tell you why this is so unique and what God is doing in history at this moment. And we know later on that they could not go to the land of Canaan yet because people there were still too evil, and they needed that evil to leave before the Israelites get there. So this wasn't God abandoning his people. He was allowing them to live in at least an environment where they weren't being killed, murdered, and brutalized on a high scale where they would have if they would have taken the promised land with the evil people all around them. So he's protecting them in a way. It's not a good protection, but it is a protection. And sometimes God protects us that way. Let us pray, and then we'll get back to work on the Labor Day Fair. Lord, we thank you for all that you have been doing for us, constantly caring for us. And as we rip through the book of Exodus, we are seeing already the mighty hand that you have to help those in need and to care for those that are in affliction. Help us to be those type of people to the world around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a good week, everyone.